So, as you can clearly see, I'm Asian. South Korean to be specific. Both of my parents are Korean. I am Korean. And I've grown up in a Korean household. But one thing that is a little different about me is that I had lived in Korea only for 6 years. Due to my dad's job, our family has been traveling and living in various different countries. Now, during those years of living abroad, from kindergarten to grade 7, and from grade 7 to grade 12, I have been experiencing two different worlds on a daily basis. As soon as I enter school, I'm an international student in an international community. But as soon as I return home, I'm a Korean daughter in a Korean household. Now, the difference between these two worlds, it was quite big for me. So as a result, I started to slowly compare the two worlds. For example, if something happened in school, I would always think, what would have happened if this was in my house? If something happened in my house, I would always think, what would have happened if this was in my school? Now, at that time, I didn't really know what I was exactly comparing. But right now, looking back, I know that I was actually comparing the different nationalities, the different culture. So I was actually thinking, what would have happened if that teacher was Korean? Or what would have happened if my parents were not Korean? But this constant comparing, it was quite subconscious. And I really did not know I was doing this until the 16th of April 2014, until the Sewol Ferry sank. Now this event, the Sewol Ferry disaster, it happened in South Korea. The Sewol Ferry that was heading to Jeju Island sank in the sea of Byung-hung Island. And this disaster was really tragic in the sense that out of the 476 passengers, only 175 of them survived. More than 300 died. And this event was more big of an issue because 325 of those passengers were 11th grade students. Now, as you might anticipate, Korea was full of grief. Everyone was mourning for their death. But this grief soon turned into enragement and anger because of the released information about the captain, Lee Jun-suk. Now the information showed that the captain, as soon as the ship started to sink, gave orders to the passengers to remain put in their cabins and wait for further instructions. Now this order was clearly illogical in the sense that as soon as the first rescue ship came, he abandoned everyone in the ship, and all the people in the ship that were waiting for further instructions drowned in the cold sea. Now, this event was more personally of a shock to me because those students were the same age as I was. But among that conglomeration of anger and sadness and shock, I had a small question that started to creep in my mind. And that was, what would have happened if those passengers were not Korean? Now, you might ask me, what does that really have to do with the event, right? I want to give you a little insight in the Korean culture. Now, in the Korean culture, we have this unwritten rule that says that in a situation, there is an inferior who has a lower social rank and a superior that has a higher social rank. Now, the inferior is to obey the orders of the superior. If they don't, they're considered rude and uneducated. Now, this concept of hierarchy is so strongly ingrained in our culture that it is prevalent in every single situation. For example, if I'm an inferior and I eat with my superior, I'm not supposed to touch the food until they start eating. If I'm an inferior and I meet a superior in the road, I need to bow down like this, and the superior is just supposed to stand there and accept my bow. The concept of hierarchy is so strongly ingrained in our culture that it is actually prevalent in our language. For example, if you say food in English, you would say food, right? But in the Korean language, we have two different ways of saying food. To an inferior, we say 밥. But to a superior, we say 진지. So if you want to ask, have you eaten yet? To an inferior, you need to say 밥 먹었어? But if you ask, have you eaten yet? To a superior, you need to say 진지 잡수셨어요? Now you can clearly see the difference, right? We have different language structures just depending on who are you using this to. That is how strong that concept of hierarchy is ingrained in our culture. Now, knowing this fact, when I read the article that said that the passengers of the ship obeyed the instructions of the captain, I just had to ask, what would have happened if those passengers were not Korean? Could it be that because they were Korean, they obeyed, and as a result, so many of them died? But this was the starting point for my investigation. I wanted to know to what extent did culture affect the Sewol Ferry incident. But even before starting, I had a very big problem, and that was, how will I know, right? For example, if you want to know that something affected the other, you need to conduct an experiment. But this real life situation, I cannot conduct an experiment. I can't recreate the same weather, the same ship, the same number of people. It's just impossible. So I said, okay, screw that, I can't do that. How about I look for an event that is very similar to the Sewol Ferry, but occurred in a different country, in a different culture. And that was when I found the Costa Concordia. Now, on the 13th of January 2012, the Costa Concordia started from a port of Italy, soon collided with the rocks of Gilgil Island, and started to sink. Now, the captain of the ship, as soon as the ship started to sink, told the passengers, everything's under control, and go into your cabins. Ironically, the captain soon abandoned the ship with the passengers on board. Now I thought, I think I read something very similar to this. The ship was sinking, the captain gave orders for the passengers to remain put in their cabins, and the captain abandoned the ship. Sewol Ferry disaster. The two events were so similar. So, did the passengers of Costa Concordia obey to the orders of the captain? Surprisingly, no. As soon as the captain gave the orders, the passengers were like, screw that, I'm not following that. A lot of people jumped into the sea and started swimming to shore. The leftovers, they started to argue to the crew members, you need to lower the lifeboat. They started demanding. The captain's orders were completely ignored. And surprisingly, as a result, only 33 out of the entire 4,252 passengers died. Now let's compare the percentage of death. Shocking, right? The two events were so similar, but in the Sewol Ferry disaster, 36.8% of the passengers died, while in the Costa Concordia, less than 1% did. So what was one of the big differences between these two events? Nationality. In the Sewol Ferry, 100% of the passengers were South Korean. However, in the Costa Concordia, the passengers were consisted of 40 different nationalities. Majority were Italian, followed by German, then French. Now my intuition was telling me there is a link between culture, the nationality, and the two different results of these events. But I had to have an objective standard that could allow me to compare the two. And that was when I found the Hofstede cultural dimension. So the Hofstede cultural dimension claims that there are 6 different dimensions that consist a culture. And the number for these 6 are different for every single country. And one of these 6 different dimensions is the power distance. And the power distance is defined as the extent to which the inferiors of the society accept and expect that power is distributed unequally. So the higher the number is for this scale, the more hierarchically oriented that culture is. So I looked for South Korea, and South Korea says it ranks 60 out of 100. Now, because I had to compare the Sewol Ferry to the Costa Concordia, and I had to choose one nationality to compare with South Korea, I chose Italy because, as I mentioned before, majority of the passengers were Italian. And Italy ranked 50 out of 100. Now, 60 versus 50, it doesn't seem like a big difference, right? But when I read the descriptions, they were drastically different. South Korea was described as everyone knows that they have a place and no further justification is needed. However, in the Italian culture, it is described as people prefer equality and decentralization of power. Now, the two descriptions were very different. And in the events, the passengers of the Sewol Ferry, who were majority Korean, obeyed the orders of the captain. But the passengers of the Costa Concordia, majority who were Italian, did not. And the Hofstede culture scale dimensions showed that the Korean culture is more hierarchically oriented than the Italian culture. So can I say, aha, I found the evidence that Korean culture affected the Sewol Ferry event? No, there were complications. And one of them were that the age difference of the passengers in the two events. In the Costa Concordia, majority of the passengers were fully grown-up adults. However, as I mentioned before, in the Sewol Ferry disaster, majority of the passengers were students. Now, who do you think would follow orders more easily, students or adults? We simply don't know, right? So I thought, okay, that gave me a possibility that maybe culture did affect the Sewol Ferry disaster. But I need more evidence. And I thought, how about I look for past disasters in South Korea that resulted in high number of casualties, like the Sewol Ferry. Maybe I can find a trend there. Surprisingly, I could find two major disasters that linked to the South Korean culture. The first one was the Sampoong department store disaster. Now, when this department store was being built, the chairman, Jun Lee, completely ignored the safety instructions and decided to change the blueprint for this department store. As a result, from 2 months before the collapse, there were visible cracks on the ceiling and there were loud breaking noises in the walls. But Jun Lee decided to do nothing about it. Now, the shocking part is the employees who worked in that building knew about this, but because they were trained to never question the authority or challenge them, no one voiced out their opinions. As a result, 502 people died and 937 were injured. Now, let's look at the second event. The Korean Air Flight 801 Guam crash. Now, this plane that was heading to the Guam airport. The pilot, despite the obvious heavy rain and the complete darkness that was surrounding the plane, decided to take a visual approach. And he ignored the flight instruments in front of him. Soon, the plane was in a chaos. The Guam airport was not in sight, and the plane was actually heading to Nimitz Hill. Now, in this situation, the captain did not know what was happening, but the first officer and the flight engineer did. However, because they were told to never voice out their opinions to the captain, they did not tell the captain or give him clear orders until 4 seconds before the crash. As a result, 228 people died out of the 254. Now, reviewing all 3 disasters, the Sewol Ferry incident, the Korean Air 801 Guam crash, and the Sampung department store disaster, they had one thing in common, and that was the inferior's perfect and complete obedience to a superior's decisions. In the Sewol Ferry disaster, the passengers to the captain. In the department store disaster, the employees to the chairman. And in the Korean Air 801, the first officer and the flight engineer to the pilot. Now, I could see that there is a clear link here. I could see that because the Korean culture is so ingrained into this concept of hierarchy, the inferiors obey to the orders of the superiors. And as a result, sometimes tragic deaths like this occur. Now, on the ending note of my investigation, after all this comparing and investigating, I started to question maybe the hierarchy concept that I thought is so beneficial and essential for the Korean society to function is actually harmful. Maybe the obedience that our culture teaches the people to have and show in emergency situations like these are actually lethal. And I want to ask you, to what extent do you think your culture affects your decisions? And think about it. Do you think maybe your own culture might somehow drive you into the road to death? And just think about it. If you were in the Sewol Ferry, in the sinking ship, what would you do? Would you listen to the captain's orders and remain put in the cabin? Or would you make a different decision? Thank you.